Over a decade after the English settled Jamestown, another English colony developed along the Massachusetts Bay. Though these settlers initially intended to establish themselves in Virginia, they missed their destination by 600 miles. Perhaps fate realized the composition and intentions of these pilgrims were so different from the men who toiled in Virginia that it saw it fit to give them a home equally distinct. Chapter 3 is dedicated to the history of the settlement of the northern and middle colonies of North America, and Pilgrims, Puritans, Quakers, Dutch, and other diverse groups of Europeans that founded them. The northern British American colonies attracted settlements for many of the same reasons as the southern colonies did. Over the 17th and 18th centuries, migrants were drawn to America by the prospects of social mobility, economic prosperity, and improved living conditions. But distinct differences between New England and the Chesapeake colonies were also apparent from the start. The most important difference was the influence of the religious motives in settling the New England colonies. Puritans seeking a land where they could practice their brand of radical Protestantism found sanctuary in the American colonies. Their intentions, unlike many of the men who migrated to the southern colonies, was to bring their families to the New World and make it their permanent home. In this unit, we will explore why English colonization efforts in the northern colonies attracted a comparatively large number of male and female migrants seeking religious freedom. To understand the origins of the religious groups that came to North America from England, we must return to the early 16th century, where Europe was aflame with religious reformation. Chapter 2 addresses the English Reformation of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, and the monarchy's decision to reject the authority of the Pope, and that created conflict at home and abroad and prevented England from building colonies in the New World. What was not discussed was how the English Reformation followed and intersected a larger Protestant Reformation, begun by German priest Martin Luther in 1517. Luther triggered a religious movement that would reshape the Christian faith when he nailed a laundry list of complaints and criticisms of Catholicism on the door of the Wittenberg Cathedral. Luther's goals were to eliminate corruption within the church's hierarchy and reform practices within the church that he believed inhibited the teachings of Jesus Christ. He wished to break the church's monopoly on the reading and interpreting of the Bible, believing it could be printed in languages other than Latin and read by anyone, not just a priest. Luther denied the role of the church. Luther denied the role the church gave the Mother Mary and the saints in the forgiveness of sin and the redemption of humanity. Furthermore, he harshly criticized how the priesthood used money to enrich the church rather than serve the community, and he condemned the entanglement the church had with European monarchs. Adherents to Luther's protests became known as Protestants. Protestantism spread across Europe. Early church reformers had to meet in secret. They faced excommunication from the church and execution as heretics. One theologian inspired by the Protestant wave sparked by Luther was French theologian John Calvin. In his seminal publication, Calvin maintained that God alone was all-powerful and capable of forgiving sins and granting salvation. Like Luther, Calvinism denied the divinity of the clergy and their ability to forgive sin and grant indulgences. That alone was God's business. Calvin's theology on salvation went even further, maintaining that the original sin of man meant humans were wicked, weak, and unable to earn redemption. Instead, an all-loving God had predestined some people for salvation, while the rest would pay for humanity's sinfulness in the fires of hell. Gnawing doubt about their eternal fate plagued Calvinists. The most spiritual control a person could exercise was to live a pious life in hopes of receiving a conversion experience, a personal sign from God that they were one of his heaven-bound elect. These members of the church were viewed then as living saints. Protestantism, especially Calvinism, spread to England, where the monarchy resisted its reforms before and after Henry VIII broke from the Catholic Church. But the English Reformation and the merging of the Crown and the Church of England made the Protestant reformers intent on purifying the Anglican Church especially intense. So much so, English Calvinists became known as Puritans. Most important to the Puritan platform was limiting church membership to only those who had experienced conversion. When the Crown rejected this requirement, a radical faction of Puritans left the Anglican Church and attempted to create their own. This separatist church was not only a threat to the Anglican Church's spiritual monopoly in England, but the king's authority over both the church and state. A year after King James chartered the Virginia Company's trip to North America, he also chased the most bothersome separatists out of the country. These refugees initially sought sanctuary in nearby Holland. A decade later, many of these refugees yearned to return to the English dominion, where their language and culture would be better preserved. But they also sought to find a place within the English kingdom where they could practice their faith without persecution. These dual motives prompted some separatists, identified as the Pilgrims, to seek permission from the Virginia Company to settle near Jamestown. On August 15, 1620, 102 men, women, and children set sail from the New World aboard a ship called the Mayflower. Less than half the travelers were Pilgrims. After 65 days at sea, the Mayflower entered the stony harbor that would become known as Cape Cod. They were 600 miles off course, but they took their safe arrival as a sign of God's providence that they were destined to settle where they were. The voyagers made a preliminary survey of the surrounding terrain and selected land near a natural harbor they would call Plymouth. The first English inhabitants to Plymouth Plantation would be squatters. But before disembarking the ship, Pilgrim leaders drew up and signed a contract. This document, dubbed the Mayflower Compact, agreed to form a government that would create laws based upon the will of the majority of the colony's 41 adult males that had signed the document. This pact was a promising first step towards a genuine self-government. While fate had smiled upon the Pilgrims as they crossed the Atlantic, it was no kinder to them during the first winter in Plymouth than it was to the settlers of Jamestown during the starving time. Only 44 of the original 102 settlers survived the winter of 1620. Yet their faith in a divine plan was absolute. When the Mayflower returned to England the following spring, not one of the separatists went back with it. This image is of Plymouth Plantation. Carefully restored, the modest village at Plymouth looks today much as it did nearly 400 years ago. The Pilgrims believed God rewarded their faith with a bountiful harvest the following autumn. In their first year, the colonists had established positive relations with the Wampanoag Indians, who taught them valuable farming, hunting, and fishing techniques in their new homeland, and became valuable trade partners. To celebrate God's merciful bounty, The Pilgrims and their native rescuers gathered together in the fall of 1621 to celebrate a Thanksgiving. Though Thanksgiving celebrations were a custom practiced in Europe and in the American colonies before the Pilgrims' arrival, the documentation of the Pilgrims' Thanksgiving with the Wampanoag in Governor William Bradford's History of the Plantation inspired the creation of the American holiday. Bradford was the colony's most famous governor, serving as its chief executive for over 30 years. His chief concern as governor was preserving the Pilgrims' religious sanctuary from the corrupting influence of non-Puritan settlers. While Plymouth's historic significance cannot be denied, it never grew to be an important economic or population center. By the end of the 17th century, the colony's population skimped along near 7,000 people. This colony of squatters never received a charter from England. Instead, it was merged with the larger neighbor Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1691. The few colonists of Plymouth would remain isolated in the New World for a decade, but the reign of Charles I and the English Civil War would create a surge of migration, especially amongst Puritans. The more moderate Puritans remaining in England and attempting to reform the Anglican Church from within, when the separatists fled England to Holland in 1608, soon gained influence in British society and in Parliament, England's lawmaking body. But when Charles dissolved Parliament in 1629, he also sanctioned anti-Puritan persecutions. Fearing that they would soon be purged as heretics, Puritan leaders John Winthrop secured a charter to form the Massachusetts Bay Company north of their separatist brothers and sisters. Charles granted this commission upon the oath that the Puritans did not want to separate from the Church of England, but only establish a new purified version in the New World. On April 8, 1630, Winthrop and 1,000 immigrants departed England for Massachusetts Bay. Their departure would be followed by a much larger wave of migrants to the Western Hemisphere. Between 1630 and 1642, 189,000 English fled the Civil War as part of the Great Migration. 60% of these migrants found their way to the West Indies, 25% to the Chesapeake colonies, and only 14%, or roughly 20,000 people, to New England. This is a map of the sources of the Puritans that migrated to the New World between 1620 and 1640. The shaded area indicates the main sources of people that migrated. These would have been rural farming districts, typically poorer, that had been most heavily impacted by the wool crisis of the turn of the 17th century. This map also demonstrates migration patterns from England during 1630 to 1642. Much of the early history of the United States was written by New Englanders who were not disposed to emphasize the larger exodus of English migrants to the Caribbean islands. When the mainland colonists declared independence in 1776, they hoped that these island outposts would join them, but the existence of the British Navy had dissuaded them from doing so. The leadership of Massachusetts Bay Governor John Winthrop would shape the colony. During the 19 years of Winthrop's leadership, the Massachusetts Bay Colony grew to become the most populous of the New England colonies. Fur trading, shipbuilding, and fishing industries made it also the most economically powerful of the region as well. But it was Winthrop's religious goals that would shape the colony the most. He believed the people of Massachusetts had a covenant with God and were expected to build a religious model to act as a city upon the hill to the rest of the world. Though most colonists arriving in New England were not Puritans, and more Puritans would settle in the Caribbean island of Barbados than in all of Massachusetts, the Bay Colony was molded more than any of the others by Calvinism. The Puritan colony of Massachusetts would also become a model for self-government. The colony allowed for a greater amount of political participation to its congregational church members, regardless of property ownership. Any white male, regardless of his wealth, who had gone through a conversion experience was considered a member of the congregational church, and thus a freeman, and allowed to vote in provincial elections and on the colony's affairs. Town meetings in New England were even more inclusive. All men with property were allowed to vote on local issues, regardless of their religious affiliations. The Church of the New England colonies became known as the Congregational Church. But Massachusetts was not a democracy. To preserve Winthrop's religious utopia, the Puritans established a theocracy, a government whose laws are shaped by religious precepts. For the Puritans, the whole purpose of government was to enforce God's laws and prevent the spread of sin. Both the government and its church were funded by taxes. Religious leaders wield immense power. Separation of church and state was not a value espoused by many British American colonies in the 17th century, especially Massachusetts Bay. For its strict adherence to theocracy, Massachusetts became known as the Bible Commonwealth. While clergy were not permitted to directly hold political office, they exercised a tremendous amount of political influence. The power to determine who was a citizen in the colony was in their hands. Ministers like John Cotton conducted public interrogations of individuals professing to have experienced conversion before they were granted their rights as citizens. Though the Puritans had suffered discrimination at the hands of leaders of the Anglican Church back in England, they saw no hypocrisy in their own religious intolerance. But the power of Puritan ministers was not absolute. Congregations checked their influence by electing and firing them democratically. In a way, this did maintain some separation between church and state. Despite their religiosity, prosperity also meant a great deal to the people of New England. They believed that if they worked hard and lived pious lives, God would reward their efforts in tangible ways. This stereotype of the Protestant work ethic was developed by the people eager to advance themselves in British North America. Nor was Puritan society devoid of pleasure. These folks loved to sing hymns, eat, drink, and reproduce. A New England woman that didn't die in childbirth could expect to have 10 children. But they did pass laws aiming to make sure that these pleasures stayed simple. Blue laws, named for the color of paper they were written upon, prohibited vain enjoyment like singing non-religious songs, dancing, and public displays of affection. They also harshly punished sinful behavior such as adultery, with public acts of shaming, jail sentences, and even execution.